Let's start right there with that powerful idea from former National Chief Perry Bellegarde. It really sets the stage perfectly because what we're talking about today isn't just about words or good intentions. We're talking about real, fundamental transformation.
You've probably heard the term economic reconciliation thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean on the ground? In this explainer, we're going to push past the buzzword and look at the concrete actions, the hard data, and the real-world impact it's having on businesses and communities all across Canada.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the call to action that really kicked this whole thing into high gear. Then, we'll see how companies are actually doing and how economic partnerships work. After that, we'll get into the tangible impact of all this, and finally, what the path forward looks like.
All right, so let's dig in. Why is this such a huge topic for Canadian business right now? I mean, it's not a brand new idea, but there was a very specific moment that really lit a fire under it.
It all goes back to 2015 and the final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, specifically Call to Action number 92. This was a direct, crystal clear message aimed squarely at corporate Canada. It wasn't some gentle suggestion, it was a formal call to action telling them to use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as their playbook for doing business. When you break it down, what it's asking for is actually really practical. It boils down to three key things. First, commit to meaningful consultation and getting consent before projects get off the ground. Second, make sure there's fair access to jobs and training. And third, and this is a piece that sometimes gets missed, actually educating your staff on Indigenous history and rights.
So you put all that together, and this is what we mean by economic reconciliation. It's a process, right? And it's so much more than just creating jobs. It's about equitable access. It's about sharing in the wealth that comes from traditional lands. And maybe most importantly, it's about communities achieving the financial sovereignty to call their own shots. Okay, so that was the call. The big question is, how has corporate Canada actually responded since 2015? Has anything really changed? Well, let's take a look at the numbers.
This chart right here, it tells a huge story. In 2016, a study looked at public companies and found that basically 0 of them mentioned Indigenous identity in their board diversity policies. 0. Fast forward just 3 years later, and that number skyrockets to 28%. That's a massive shift happening at the very top levels of business. And it's not just policy talk in the boardroom either. That same research found that the number of companies saying they prioritize hiring Indigenous people has doubled. So we're seeing that intention start to turn into real action.
But, and this is a big but, it's not a perfect success story everywhere. There are still some pretty significant gaps. Just look at Canada's booming tech sector. A report showed Indigenous people held only about 2.2% of tech jobs. That's less than half the rate for non-Indigenous people. It really highlights that even with progress, there's a long, long way to go, especially in some of the most important parts of our economy.
So how do we start to close those gaps? Well, it's not just about hiring one person at a time. It's about building bigger, more collaborative structures. And this is where something really powerful comes into play: economic partnerships and joint ventures. This completely reframes the whole conversation. Because these authentic partnerships, they aren't just about social good. They're a massive strategic advantage for businesses. You get a competitive edge, you tap into a local, skilled workforce, you build real community support, which, by the way, lowers your project risk. It's a true win-win.
Let me tell you a quick story to show you what this can look like on the ground. This is Sydney Marr. She's a Niklapapamux entrepreneur, and like a lot of small business owners, she looked at the federal government as a potential client, but thought the whole process just looked way too complicated and intimidating. But she got some support from a group called Procurement Assistance Canada, and they helped her figure out the system. And guess what? She won a contract. Her experience totally changed her perspective, and now she's a huge advocate for other Indigenous entrepreneurs to go for it. And Sydney's story isn't just a happy accident. It's directly connected to a major policy shift. The federal government has now mandated that a minimum of 5% of the total value of all its contracts has to go to Indigenous businesses. This is a huge, concrete commitment designed to open up exactly these kinds of opportunities on a massive scale. All right, so we've got the call to action, we've got corporate policies changing, and we've got these partnerships forming. So what's the bottom line? What does this all add up to? Let's look at the actual, tangible economic impact. Check this out.
A recent analysis found that the annual economic impact of Indigenous peoples on just one city, Thunder Bay, is over $1.5 billion. Think about that. This shows that Indigenous economies aren't some separate thing. They are a massive engine driving the whole Canadian economy.
And if you want a perfect example of financial sovereignty in action, look no further than the First Nations Bank of Canada. It started out in '96 with about $10 million in capital. By 2009, Indigenous shareholders took majority control, and by 2022, its assets had exploded to over $1.19 billion. That is an incredible story of Indigenous-led finance.
Now this is where it gets really exciting when we look to the future. In this super important renewable energy sector, when projects are located within Indigenous communities, a staggering 92% of them are either partially or wholly Indigenous owned. This is the model, right here. It shows communities aren't just participating, they are leaders and majority equity holders in the green economy.
Okay, we've seen the call, we've seen the progress, and we've seen the impact. The progress is absolutely real, but the journey's not over. So the big question is, where do we go from here?
Well, for any companies watching, the experts have a pretty clear playbook. First, adopt reconciliation indicators and then report on them publicly every year. Be transparent. Second, set real, meaningful targets for hiring and for buying from Indigenous businesses. And third, commit to established frameworks like the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program. It's basically a roadmap to success.
And if you're still wondering why this matters to every single person in Canada, just look at this number. The National Indigenous Economic Development Board did the math. They found that if we closed the economic gap, it would add almost $28 billion to Canada's GDP every single year. This isn't just a moral imperative, folks. It's a massive economic opportunity for the entire country.
And that really brings us full circle. As we've seen today, this isn't about checking a box or hitting some finish line. Economic reconciliation is an ongoing process of transformation. The progress is real, but so are the challenges that remain. So the question we're all left with is this: what does the next step on this path look like for businesses, for governments, and for each and every one of us?